This presentation contains descriptions of violence, death, and disturbing themes rooted in folklore. Viewer discretion is advised. Her face, once praised for its beauty, was now a ruin of melted flesh. A poisoned cream, a gift from her treacherous husband, had done its work. One side of her face drooped in a grotesque parody of a smile, her eye swollen completely shut. But the other eye was wide open, black with a hatred so pure it burned hotter than any funeral pyre. And it was staring directly at the man who had betrayed her, the man who had cast her aside for a younger bride. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was a receipt for a debt, about to be paid in blood. What you just heard is the beginning of Japan's most famous ghost story. But the spirit it describes is not like the ghosts we know in the West. It doesn't just rattle chains or knock on walls. It doesn't haunt a house. It haunts a bloodline. It is a focused, intelligent, and unstoppable engine of vengeance. It is a Yurei, and it follows a set of terrifyingly specific rules, born from the moment of a violent, unjust death. These rules dictate how they look, how they kill, and what they want. And the most terrifying rule of all is that their grudge is a curse that can spread like a plague. So how do you stop a ghost that will never forget, never forgive, and never ever rest? The answer is hidden in the very rituals that failed to protect them in the first place. To understand the Yurei, you have to understand a fundamental difference in how the soul is perceived. In the West, we often think of a soul's journey as a one-way ticket, to heaven, to hell, to a final resting place. But in the blend of Japanese Buddhist and Shinto beliefs, the soul, or reikon, has a more complex journey. After death, the reikon is believed to linger, waiting for the proper funeral and burial rites to be performed. These rituals are not just for the living to grieve. They are a crucial roadmap for the dead, guiding the soul to join its ancestors in the afterlife, becoming a revered protector of the family. But what happens when that roadmap is destroyed? What happens when the soul is ripped from the body so violently, so unexpectedly, that it can't see the path forward? What happens when it's weighed down by an anchor of pure, unadulterated rage? This is the genesis of a Yurei. The word itself is deceptively simple. Yu means faint or dim, and rei means soul or spirit. A faint spirit. But there is nothing faint about their power. They are souls trapped between our world and the next, denied peace by one of three critical failures. The first and most common is a violent or wrongful death. A murder, a betrayal, a death in battle, or even a suicide born of despair. The sheer shock and trauma of this moment acts like a spiritual cataclysm. The soul is not gently released, it is shattered. It becomes an Onryō, a vengeful spirit, defined not by who it was in life, but by the injustice of its end. Its final moments of agony, fear, and hatred become its entire existence, replaying for eternity. The second path to becoming a Yurei is through the power of an unfulfilled, obsessive emotion. This isn't always vengeance. It can be a profound love for a person left behind, a deep-seated jealousy, or a solemn duty that was left unfinished. These emotions are so powerful that they tether the soul to the physical world, refusing to let go until its purpose is fulfilled. These are the ghosts of heartbroken lovers waiting for a return that will never come, or loyal retainers guarding a tomb long after their lord has turned to dust. They are a testament to the fact that a promise can be stronger than death itself. But the third and most culturally significant reason is the failure to perform the proper last rites. If a body is lost, if it's desecrated, or if the family neglects their ceremonial duties, the soul becomes a lost orphan. It has no guide, no peace, no place to go. It wanders the world, confused, sorrowful, and increasingly desperate. This desperation can curdle into a bitter resentment, not just for those who failed them, but for all the living who get to enjoy the world they've been locked out of. The transformation is not instant. It's a horrifying decay of the soul. Imagine all your memories, your loves, your joys, your identity, slowly being burned away, until all that remains is the white-hot core of your single defining trauma. A murdered woman no longer remembers her children's laughter. She remembers only the blade and the face of her killer. A betrayed samurai no longer remembers his honor. He remembers only the taste of poison and the shame of his death. This singular burning purpose is what makes them so much more dangerous than a simple, wandering spirit. A Yurei has a target, and when they manifest, they follow a chillingly consistent visual pattern, a kind of ghostly uniform that tells the story of their damnation. They almost always appear dressed in a shirashakuku, a simple white burial kimono, The cloth is folded left over right, the way corpses are dressed for burial in Japan. This immediately signals that they are dead. A soul that has begun its funeral journey but has been brutally interrupted. They are forever trapped on their own deathbed. Then there is the hair. Long, black, and disheveled. In classical Japan, a woman's long, perfectly combed black hair was a symbol of her beauty and status. The Yurei's hair is wild, unkempt, often obscuring its face. A symbol of its descent into madness and its rejection of the world of the living. It's a crown of chaos, a visual representation of the turmoil raging within its soul. Perhaps most unsettling is what you don't see. Yurei are almost always depicted without feet or legs, fading away into nothingness below the waist. This tradition actually began in the theater. In kabuki plays, actors portraying ghosts would be lifted by ropes, their long kimonos hiding their feet, creating an eerie floating effect. This stage trick was so effective, so deeply unsettling, that it became part of the folklore itself. It symbolizes their untethered nature. They no longer belong to the earth. They float between worlds, unbound by gravity, unbound by reason. This ghostly form is animated by one of the most terrifying concepts in all of folklore: onin. Onin is often translated as grudge or vengeance, but that fails to capture its true horror. Onin is a physical force. It is a contagion of rage, born from a person's dying moments, that is so powerful it can outlive the person who created it. It can soak into the very floorboards of a house where a murder took place. It can cling to an object like a doll or a weapon. It can latch onto any person who comes into contact with that place or object. Onin is not just an emotion. It is a nuclear reactor of hate that fuels the Yurei, giving it the power to defy the laws of nature, to inflict physical harm, and to spread its curse to the innocent. It is the reason why the ghost of one murdered woman can bring down an entire family, an entire village generations after her death. We now understand the blueprint of a Yurei. A soul shattered by trauma, denied its final rest, and rebuilt by a singular all-consuming purpose. But knowing how they are made is only the beginning. The true terror lies in what they do. They don't just haunt, they hunt. They are supernatural predators with a very specific prey in mind. And their methods are as varied and as cruel as the betrayals that created them. To understand their methods, you first have to understand their motivation, which is boiled down to a single potent concept: on. This isn't just a grudge. On is a deep, binding obligation, a debt that must be repaid. When someone is wronged, a debt is created. In life, that debt might be settled through justice or apology, but when a life is stolen through treachery, the debt becomes supernatural. It becomes a stain on the world, an imbalance in the cosmic order. And the Yurei is the collection agent. It exists for no other reason than to settle that account, and the only currency it accepts is suffering. This isn't the kind of haunting you see in Western horror. A Yurei doesn't just knock over a vase or whisper in a hallway to scare the new tenants out. That's child's play. A Yurei's curse is a targeted psychological weapon. It's a contagion of despair that infects the life of its target, dismantling it piece by piece, savoring the fear before delivering the final fatal blow. And perhaps no story illustrates this terrifying process better than the most famous ghost story in all of Japan, the tale of Onryō. Onryō was a woman married to a man named Iman, a masterless samurai, a ronin with ambitions far grander than his station. Iman was a man who craved power and status, and he saw his gentle, devoted wife, Onryō, as an obstacle. An opportunity soon presented itself in the form of a wealthy local official's daughter, who became infatuated with Iman. The girl's family, seeing a chance to marry her off, offered Iman a prominent position and a life of luxury, on one condition. He had to get rid of Onryō. For a man like Iman, this was not a moral dilemma. It was a logistical problem. Divorce was an option, but it would be messy and could damage his reputation. So, he and his new prospective father-in-law devised a more permanent, more insidious solution. They procured a potent poison, but not one that would kill her outright. No, that would be too obvious. This was a special toxin disguised as a facial cream, a gift for Onryō to help her recover her strength after a recent childbirth. Trusting her husband, Onryō applied the cream. The effects were not immediate, but they were catastrophic. Her face began to swell and distort. Her features twisted into a grotesque parody of her former beauty. One of her eyes drooped, bulging from its socket. Her hair, once her pride, began to fall out in clumps, leaving bloody patches on her scalp. When Iman finally showed her a mirror, the shock was so profound, her horror so absolute, that she collapsed and died from a broken heart. In some versions of the tale, she grabs a sword in her grief and accidentally punctures her own throat. Either way, her end was agony, staring at a monstrous reflection of her husband's betrayal. With Onryō gone, Iman and his accomplices nailed her body, along with the body of her infant son whom they'd also murdered, to a wooden door and threw it into the river. Problem solved. Iman was free to marry his new, wealthy bride and begin the life he so desperately craved. The wedding was planned, the ceremony began, and as Iman lifted the veil to look upon the face of his new wife, he saw Onryō. Not the beautiful woman he'd married, but the disfigured, one-eyed horror he had created. Her face, swollen and bleeding, stared back at him with an expression of pure, undiluted hatred. He let out a scream of terror and without thinking drew his sword and struck. The vision vanished, but the blood now pooling on the floor was very real. In his panic, he had decapitated his new bride in front of all their wedding guests. Fleeing the scene in a blind panic, he ran to his new father-in-law's home to explain the madness that had overcome him. But as he confronted the old man, the face he saw was not his father-in-law's. It was the face of Onryō's other victim, the accomplice who had helped him dispose of her body. Again his sword lashed out. And again, he found he had murdered an innocent. The curse was now in full control. Everywhere Iman went, Onryō followed. She wasn't just a ghost in a house, she was a ghost in his mind. He would light a paper lantern for guidance in the dark, and as the flame flickered within, the paper would stretch and warp, forming Onryō's monstrous face, moaning his name. He would try to eat, and her face would appear in his soup. He would flee to the mountains, seeking refuge in a remote cabin, only to see her hanging from the rafters, her long tangled hair brushing against his face. The haunting was relentless. It wasn't about jump scares. It was about the slow, agonizing erosion of his sanity. She made him relive his crime over and over, turning his own guilt and paranoia into the instruments of his torture. She forced him to destroy everything he had murdered her to obtain. His new wife, his status, his wealth, his mind, all were systematically annihilated by the specter of his betrayal. Finally, driven completely mad, Iman was cornered. In some versions, he's found by Onryō's loyal brother-in-law, who enacts a mortal revenge. In others, he simply succumbs to the madness, hunted down by the phantom that would never, ever let him rest. His death was the final payment on the debt, the closing of the account. But here is the most terrifying part of Onryō's story, and the true nature of the Yurei's curse. It didn't end with Iman. The curse spread like a plague. Everyone involved in the plot, everyone who benefited from Onryō's death, every member of Iman's new family, they all met tragic, untimely ends. The curse was not just a personal vendetta. It was a supernatural contagion that eradicated the entire legacy of the transgression. It burned the rot out from the root, ensuring that nothing born from such a deep betrayal would ever be allowed to flourish. This is the blueprint for the Onryō, the vengeful ghost. Their power isn't just in their ability to appear. It's in their profound understanding of psychological warfare. They don't just want you dead. They want you to suffer as they suffered. They want you to lose what you value most. If they were betrayed for beauty, they will use beauty to destroy you. If they were drowned, water will become your enemy. Their vengeance is a form of gruesome, poetic justice, tailored specifically to their tormentor. The story of Onryō became so infamous, it was adapted into a kabuki play called Yotsuya Kaiden, and the curse, it seems, attached itself to the play itself. To this day, it's considered the most cursed production in Japan. Productions are plagued by mysterious accidents, injuries, and even deaths among the cast and crew. It has become a tradition for the director and principal actors to visit Onryō's grave in Tokyo to ask for her blessing before the show begins, hoping to appease the spirit they are about to portray. They know that a Yurei's memory is long, and their grudge doesn't distinguish between reality and performance. So we see how a personal betrayal creates a laser-focused supernatural predator. But what happens when the rage isn't directed at just one person? What happens when the tragedy is so profound it stains the very land it happened on, creating a grudge that doesn't hunt a person, but instead waits patiently for anyone foolish enough to trespass? To answer that, we have to travel to the Shimonoseki Strait, a narrow strip of water separating two of Japan's main islands. Today, it's a bustling channel of commerce, crisscrossed by massive container ships and ferries. But beneath these modern vessels, under the churning currents, the water holds a memory. A cold, dark memory of a battle that ended an era and gave birth to a legion of ghosts. This isn't just a haunted place. It's a wound on the face of the earth that has never healed. This is the domain of the Jibakurei, spirits bound to the place of their death. Unlike the Onryō we've discussed, who might follow their target across the globe, a Jibakurei is a form of spiritual landmine. It's a ghost anchored by the sheer gravity of its own demise. The tragedy was so immense, the emotions so potent, that they soaked into the very soil, the rocks, the water itself. The grudge isn't mobile. It's a permanent feature of the landscape, an invisible, malevolent radiation that poisons the area. It doesn't hunt you. It simply waits for you to make the mistake of stepping into its territory. Our story begins in the 12th century, during the final bloody days of the Genpei War. Two mighty clans, the Genji and the Haika, had been tearing Japan apart for years in a brutal civil war. The Haika, once the powerful rulers of the nation, were now on the run. Beaten, cornered, they gathered their remaining forces for one last, desperate stand at sea, in the Strait of Dan no Yura. On their flagship was their most precious treasure, the source of their divine right to rule, the 8-year-old Emperor Antoku. The battle was a catastrophe for the Haika. The tides, which had initially favored them, turned. The Genji archers rained death upon their ships. Defeat was not just certain. It was absolute. For the noble ladies and samurai of the Haika court, capture by their hated rivals was a fate worse than death. And so the emperor's grandmother, Lady Ni, made a decision. Taking the child emperor in her arms, she turned to him and said, "In the depths of the ocean is our capital." Then, clutching the boy and the sacred imperial treasures, she leaped into the violent, churning water. Her act triggered a wave of mass suicide. One by one, then dozen by dozen, the remaining Haika warriors and court members followed her into the sea, choosing an honorable death in the cold depths over a dishonorable life in the hands of the Genji. The water ran red, and the air was filled with the final cries of a defeated clan. But their story didn't end there. Their souls, ripped from their bodies in a moment of ultimate despair and humiliation, could not move on. They became Yurei, tethered forever to the site of their final agony. The Strait of Dan no Yura became their eternal prison and their hunting ground. For centuries since, local fishermen have told stories. They speak of strange, pale lights, known as onabi or demon fire, that bob and dance on the surface of the waves on moonless nights, said to be the souls of the drowned warriors. They whisper of hearing the clang of swords and the wails of the dying carried on the wind when no other ships are in sight. They say that if you look down into the water on a calm day, you might see the ghostly faces of the dead looking back up at you. Perhaps the most fascinating piece of this legend is something you can hold in your hand. The waters of the strait are home to a species of crab known as the haikigani. What makes them unique is the pattern on their shells. It bears an uncanny, almost perfect resemblance to the scowling face of a samurai warrior. Local legend says these crabs are the reincarnations of the drowned Haika soldiers, still roaming the seabed in their eternal rage. For centuries, fishermen who caught these crabs would throw them back out of respect and fear for the angry spirits they housed. Modern science, of course, has an explanation involving genetics and centuries of fishermen subconsciously sparing the crabs that looked most like faces, but for those who live near the strait, the truth is far more chilling. This ghostly court, however, doesn't just stay beneath the waves. They remember their former glory, and they crave the comforts they once knew. This brings us to the most famous tale of Dan no Yura, the story of Hoichi the Earless. Hoichi was a blind musician, a traveling bard who played an instrument called a biwa. He was renowned throughout the land for one thing above all else: his heart-wrenching recitation of the tale of the Haika, the epic poem that chronicled the Genpei War. He sang with such passion and sorrow that it was said even goblins would weep to hear him. One night, while staying at a temple near the strait, Hoichi was approached by a gruff, imposing samurai. The samurai commanded Hoichi to bring his biwa and follow him, explaining that his lord, a powerful nobleman staying nearby, wished to hear him perform. Being a lowly blind musician, Hoichi had no choice but to obey. He was led through the night to what felt like a massive, bustling estate. He could hear the rustle of silk garments, the quiet footsteps of many attendants, and the authoritative voice of the Lord himself. He was ordered to play the tale of the final battle at Dan no Yura. Hoichi tuned his biwa and began to sing. He poured all of his soul into the performance, his voice cracking with emotion as he described the turning of the tide, the arrows falling like rain, and the final tragic leap of the child emperor into the sea. When he finished, he heard not applause but deep gut-wrenching sobs echoing all around him. The Lord was deeply moved and ordered Hoichi to return for the next 6 nights to perform the same passage. And so, night after night, the samurai would come for Hoichi, and he would be led to the mysterious court to play for the weeping nobles. But the priests at his temple grew worried. They noticed that each morning Hoichi looked paler, weaker, and more drained than the last. He seemed to be wasting away. One night, a priest followed him in secret. But he didn't see a grand estate. He saw Hoichi sitting alone in the middle of the cemetery, furiously playing his biwa in front of Emperor Antoka's tomb, surrounded by countless flickering ghost lights. Hoichi wasn't playing for a noble lord. He was playing for the dead. The ghostly court of the Haika clan was summoning him from beyond the grave, and their spectral presence was draining his very life force. The head priest knew he had to act. He explained the terrible truth to Hoichi and devised a plan. He and another monk painted Hoichi's entire body, from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, with the sacred characters of the Heart Sutra, a powerful Buddhist scripture meant to make him invisible to the spirits. They instructed him to sit perfectly still and silent in his room when the samurai came for him that night, no matter what happened. That night, Hoichi sat meditating as he heard the heavy footsteps of the samurai approach. The samurai called his name. Hoichi, terrified, remained silent. The samurai entered the room and looked around. With the sutras covering his body, Hoichi was completely invisible. The ghost could see the biwa floating in the air, but not the man holding it. The samurai grumbled, "No sign of the musician, but his ears are here." In their haste, the priests had forgotten to paint the sutras on Hoichi's ears. To the ghost, they were the only part of him that was visible. The samurai, needing proof for his lord that he had found the musician, reached out, grabbed the floating ears, and tore them from Hoichi's head. Hoichi, despite the searing pain, did not make a sound. The samurai left, and Hoichi was found the next morning, bleeding but alive. His ordeal was over. The ghosts never bothered him again. And while he lost his ears, he gained great fame. People from all over Japan came to hear the story and the music of Hoichi the Earless. Hoichi's tale is the perfect illustration of a place-based curse. The ghosts of Danno Yura held no specific grudge against him. He hadn't wronged them. He was simply a man with a unique talent who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He trespassed on haunted ground and was pulled into the endless, repeating tragedy of the Haika clan. He wasn't a target. He was collateral damage in a spiritual war that ended centuries ago, but whose echoes still claim victims to this day. This is the terror of the Jibakurai. It is an indiscriminate, eternal rage that has become one with the land itself. But what happens when that land isn't a windswept battlefield or a blood-soaked strait? What happens when that cursed ground is the one place you're supposed to feel safe? What kind of Yurei is born when the tragedy isn't national but deeply, horribly personal, and it happens inside your own home? To answer that, we need to step inside a home in 17th century Edo. It's the home of a low-ranking samurai, a masterless ronin named Tamiya Aiman, and his beautiful wife Oiwa. On the surface, it's a simple life. But beneath the floorboards of this humble house, a rot is beginning to fester. Aiman is a man of weak character and soaring ambition. He's tired of being poor, tired of his simple life, and he's grown tired of Oiwa, especially after the difficult birth of their child leaves her weakened. Opportunity comes knocking in the form of a rich doctor's beautiful granddaughter, who becomes infatuated with Aiman. Her family, seeing a chance to marry her off, offers Aiman a deal. Leave your wife, marry Arum, and you'll have wealth, status, everything you've ever dreamed of. For a man like Aiman, this isn't a moral dilemma. It's a business transaction. But he can't simply divorce Oiwa. That would be messy, dishonorable. No, he needs her out of the way. Permanently. So he conspires with a local doctor, who provides him with a special post-childbirth medicine for Oiwa. It is, of course, a potent poison, but not one that kills quickly. This poison is designed for cruelty. It's a topical venom that horribly disfigures. Oiwa, trusting her husband, applies the cream to her face. The results are catastrophic. Her eye droops, her face swells into a grotesque mask, and her beautiful long black hair begins to fall out in clumps. She is a monster. When Aimen returns home, he doesn't feign sympathy. He recoils in manufactured horror, declaring he can't possibly be married to such a hideous creature. This is the moment the true horror begins. It isn't just murder. It's a complete psychological dismantling. He has not only destroyed her beauty, the one thing she felt she had left, but he has used it as the very excuse to cast her aside. The betrayal is absolute. In some versions of the story, in a fit of grief and rage, she trips and impales herself on a sword. In others, Aimen's accomplices finish the job. But in every telling, her last breath is not a sigh of release. It is a curse, a promise of vengeance, whispered with the last of her strength, directed squarely at Aimen. This is how an Onryō is born. An Onryō is not just a ghost. It's a specific and terrifying classification of Yurei. The word itself translates to vengeful spirit, and that is its entire reason for being. While other Yurei might be lost or sad, or tied to a location, the Onryō is an engine of pure, focused rage. Its existence is fueled by a singular, burning injustice committed against it in life. And the spirit of Oiwa is perhaps the most famous Onryō in all of Japanese folklore. Aimen, of course, gets what he wants. He disposes of Oiwa's body, gets engaged to the wealthy and prepares for his new life. But on his wedding night, as he lifts his new bride's veil, he doesn't see the beautiful young face he expects. He sees the drooping eye, the swollen flesh, the terrifying, accusing face of Oiwa. In a panic, he draws his sword and strikes, decapitating his bride. But as the head rolls to the floor, the illusion shatters, and he sees he has just murdered his new wife. From that moment on, Oiwa is everywhere. Aimen flees, but there is no escape. He sees her disfigured face in a paper lantern, which then speaks her name. He tries to sleep, only to be tormented by her ghostly voice. He looks in a mirror and sees her reflection staring back instead of his own. Her long black hair, a symbol of her beauty and life, now becomes a weapon. It grows from the ceiling, it snakes out of the floorboards, it even appears in his tea. The haunting is relentless, a campaign of psychological warfare designed to shatter his sanity before it takes his life. This is the critical nature of the Onryō's curse. It's not a simple jump scare and a quick death. It is a contagion of misery. The rage of the Onryō is so powerful it infects everything it touches. It doesn't just haunt the person who wronged it. It taints the very ground where the tragedy occurred. The house where Oiwa was murdered is now a cursed place. Anyone who enters it is at risk. The curse radiates outwards, a spiritual sickness that consumes not only the target, but their family, their friends, anyone who comes into contact with the lingering rage. This concept is so central to Japanese horror that it has its own name, Juon, the grudge. It's the idea that when a person dies with a deep and powerful grudge, a curse is born. It's a stain that can never be washed clean. It latches onto the place of death and reenacts the horror on anyone who dares to enter. The Onryō is not bound by the same rules as a Western ghost. It doesn't just want to scare you out of its house. It wants to make you a part of its endless, repeating tragedy. Think about the sheer terror of that. This isn't a spirit you can reason with. You can't perform a simple exorcism or say you're sorry. The Onryō's pain is so profound, its thirst for vengeance so absolute, that it has become a force of nature. It operates on a logic of pure, undiluted emotion. It doesn't distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. If you step into its domain, you are simply fuel for the fire of its rage. You are another victim to be absorbed into its cycle of death and despair. Oiwa's story, first staged as a kabuki play called Yatsuya Kaiden in 1825, was so terrifying, so resonant, that it became a cultural phenomenon. It tapped into a primal fear, the fear that the deepest betrayals come from those we trust the most, and that the sanctity of the home can be violated and turned into a personal hell. The story became a legend in itself, with actors who portrayed Oiwa or Aimen reportedly suffering from mysterious illnesses, accidents, and even death. To this day, production companies making a film or play based on her story will travel to her shrine in Tokyo to ask for her blessing, hoping to avoid the wrath of Japan's most infamous ghost. The Onryō, born from this intimate, domestic horror, creates a blueprint for a unique kind of fear. It's not about a monster in the closet. It's about the monster who was in your bed, in your heart. It's the terror of a love that has curdled into a hate so powerful it transcends death itself. It's a promise that some wounds don't just leave scars, they leave a ghost. a ghost whose rage can burn down the world. This image of the pale woman with the disfigured face and long, stringy black hair, crawling, twitching, emerging from the shadows of a normal home, has become the single most dominant and terrifying archetype in modern Japanese horror. But how did the story of a samurai's wife from the 17th century evolve to give us the specters that crawl out of our television sets and haunt our videotapes? How did Oiwa's personal tragedy lay the groundwork for the global horror icons of the modern age? The answer lies not in a slow, gradual evolution, but in a single explosive cultural event. A theatrical bombshell that dropped on the city of Edo in the summer of 1825. The play was called Takedo Yatsuya Kaden, or The Ghost Story of Yatsuya, and it didn't just tell Oiwa's story, it weaponized it. It took the raw, emotional power of her betrayal and forged it into a template, a visual language for terror that we are still using 200 years later. Imagine sitting in that theater. The air is thick with the heat of a Tokyo summer and the smell of oil lamps. You're not watching a movie. There are no jump scares edited in post. This is live. The actors are right there. And when Oiwa's ghost appears, it's unlike anything anyone has ever seen. The playwright, Tsuruya Namboku, was a master of spectacle and psychological horror. He understood that to truly scare an audience you had to break reality. He used every trick in the book: revolving stages, trapdoors, and revolutionary special effects. In one iconic scene, the villain Iman is fishing. He pulls up a wooden plank from the river, and on it, nailed like a grotesque crucifixion, are the bodies of Oiwa and another of his victims. But then as he stares in horror, Oiwa's head turns. Her long black hair begins to move, to snake through the water. Her voice, distorted and ethereal, whispers his name from the plank. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was a visceral, multi-sensory assault. The play was so successful, so shockingly terrifying, that it had to be shut down before its scheduled run was over, because it was literally causing a public disturbance. But more important than the shock value was the visual code it established. Everything we associate with the modern Yurei was born on that kabuki stage. First, the appearance. Oiwa appeared in a white burial kimono, the shiroshakuku. Before this play, ghosts in Japanese art were depicted in various ways, often looking just as they did in life. But Namboku codified the image of the ghost as a corpse, forever trapped in its funereal robes. This single choice connected the specter directly to the moment of death and burial, a constant, chilling reminder of their unresolved passage into the afterlife. Then there's the hair, the long, stringy black hair that covers the face. In Edo period Japan, a woman's hair was a symbol of her status, her honor, her very identity. It was meticulously styled and cared for. For Oiwa's ghost to appear with her hair down, wild and unkempt, was a powerful visual statement. It signified a complete rejection of societal norms, a shedding of her human identity to become something primal and untamed. The face hidden behind the curtain of hair became a symbol of the unknown, the terrifying mystery of what lay on the other side of the veil. And of course, the pale white face. This was a practical choice born from the stage. Kabuki actors used thick white rice powder makeup called ashiroi to be seen in the dim, candlelit theaters. But in the context of Oiwa, it took on a new meaning. It wasn't just makeup. It was the pallor of a corpse drained of all life and warmth. It was the face of death itself. Perhaps the most brilliant innovation of the play was something the audience didn't see. Feet. The Yurei in Yatsuya Kaden were depicted as having no feet, hovering or drifting just above the ground. This was achieved through clever stagecraft, using specialized lifts and rigging to make the actor appear to float. This simple visual trick had a profound psychological impact. A ghost that walks is still bound by the rules of our world. A ghost that floats is entirely alien. It belongs to another realm, unbound by gravity, unbound by logic, able to appear and disappear at will. This single element, born from theatrical necessity, became one of the most defining and terrifying characteristics of the Yurei. These elements, the white kimono, the long black hair, the pale face, the lack of feet, became the Yurei starter pack. It was a visual shorthand for terror, instantly recognizable and deeply unsettling. Yatsuya Kaden was so influential that other ghost stories and plays began to adopt its visual style, cementing it in the public consciousness. Oiwa's image became the blueprint for all vengeful female ghosts to follow. But the play's influence didn't stop at the edge of the stage. A dark legend began to grow around the production itself, a legend that persists to this day. It's said that the play is cursed. Tsuruya Namboku, the playwright, died shortly after its premiere. Strange accidents, illnesses, and even deaths have plagued productions of Yatsuya Kaiden for centuries. Lights fall. Props break. Actors suffer mysterious injuries or forget their lines during crucial scenes. The curse became so widely feared that a tradition developed. Before any company stages the play, the director and principal actors must make a pilgrimage to Oiwa's grave in Tokyo to ask for her permission and blessing. To stage the play without paying this tribute is considered an invitation for disaster. This real-world superstition blurred the line between fiction and reality, making Oiwa's story feel terrifyingly present. She wasn't just a character in a play. She was a real active force, a spirit whose anger could reach out from the past and affect the present. This meta-narrative, the story around the story, gave her a power that few fictional creations ever achieve. So how do we get from a cursed 19th century stage play to a haunted VHS tape? The bridge is the 20th century, and the invention of cinema. When Japan began developing its own film industry, it looked to its rich history of folklore and theater for stories. And what story was more dramatic, more visually arresting than Yatsuya Kaiden? It was adapted for the screen for the first time in 1912, and has been remade dozens of times since. Early Japanese cinema, particularly in the years following the devastation of World War II, was grappling with immense national trauma. The old certainties were gone. The country was rebuilding itself, both physically and culturally. In this atmosphere of anxiety and change, the old ghost stories found a new, potent resonance. Oiwa's story was no longer just about a samurai's betrayal. It became a vessel for deeper anxieties. It was about the breakdown of tradition, the terror of unchecked ambition, and the horrifying consequences of personal and national trauma left to fester. The ghost on screen was different from the ghost on stage. The camera could do things the kabuki theater couldn't. It could use close-ups to show the madness in a character's eyes. It could use editing to create jarring, disorienting jump scares. It could use sound design to make a whisper feel like a scream. Film took the visual template of Oiwa, the white dress, the hair, the pale face, and infused it with a new kind of psychological dread. The ghost was no longer just an external threat. It was an internal one, a manifestation of guilt and fear that could follow you anywhere. The classic 1959 film adaptation, The Ghost of Yatsuya, is a masterclass in this. It uses stark, black and white cinematography to create a world of oppressive shadows. Oiwa's ghost isn't just a specter. She's a psychological infection, her face appearing in lanterns, in cups of tea, her voice echoing in the wind. The film showed that Oiwa's power wasn't just in her physical appearance, but in her ability to corrupt reality itself, to turn the mundane world into a living nightmare for her tormentor. This was the critical step. The visual language was set by the kabuki theater, but it was cinema that taught the ghost how to haunt the modern world. It took her out of the feudal past and placed her squarely in the anxieties of the present. The stage had given the Yurei its body, but the silver screen gave it its soul. It created a ghost perfectly suited to a new era of mass media, a specter that was ready to make one final terrifying leap, from the movie screen, through the television set, and right into our living rooms. And with that leap, the nature of fear changed forever. The television wasn't like the cinema. The cinema was a public ritual, a shared experience in a dark room full of strangers. The television was an oracle, a glowing hearth planted in the most intimate space of your life. It was a window to the world, but as any good horror fan knows, when you stare into a window, sometimes something stares back. This new medium, this electronic guest in our homes, was the perfect conduit for an ancient terror to find a new, deeply personal voice. The stage was set for the single most influential ghost of the modern era, a ghost born not of ancient legend, but of analog tape and cathode ray tubes. A ghost named Sadako. The story begins not on screen but on the page. In 1991, author Koji Suzuki published a novel called Ring. It was a masterful blend of supernatural horror, mystery, and a new creeping anxiety of the information age. Suzuki's genius was to take the fundamental structure of a classic Japanese ghost story, the Onryō, the woman wronged, the cursed object, and reskin it for the late 20th century. The cursed object was no longer a samurai's sword or a painted scroll. It was a VHS tape, an unmarked, unassuming piece of plastic and magnetic film that carried not a movie, but a contagion. This was a paradigm shift. The curse wasn't just a spiritual affliction. It was a piece of viral media. It spread from person to person not through bloodlines or broken promises, but through the simple act of pressing play. And once you watched the grainy, disjointed, and deeply unsettling images on the tape, your phone would ring. A voice on the other end would seal your fate. You had 7 days. In 1998, Hideo Nakata adapted Suzuki's novel into the film Ringu, and in doing so he unleashed a cultural phenomenon. Nakata understood that the true horror wasn't just the ghost, but the medium of its transmission. He weaponized the mundane, the fuzzy static of a bad signal, the low-fidelity hum of a VCR, the shrill, piercing ring of a landline telephone. These everyday sounds became omens of death. The film tapped into a latent distrust of the very technology that was connecting the world. It suggested that in our rush to record and replicate everything, we might accidentally copy something that was never meant to be seen. And at the heart of it all was Sadako Yamamura. On the surface, she is a classic Onryō. Dressed in a simple white garment, her face perpetually hidden by a curtain of long, stringy black hair. She is a direct visual descendant of the Yurei from kabuki theater and ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Her backstory is one of tragic betrayal. A powerful psychic, feared and misunderstood, bludgeoned and thrown down a well to be forgotten. Her rage is righteous, her vengeance absolute. But Sadako is so much more than a traditional ghost in modern clothes. She is the ghost in the machine. The well she was thrown into didn't just become her grave. It became the source code for her curse. The videotape is her method of reproduction. She doesn't just haunt a place, she haunts a format. She is a psychic virus, and the 7-day countdown is her incubation period. This 7-day warning is one of the most brilliant and terrifying mechanics in all of horror. It replaces the sudden shock of a jump scare with the slow, gnawing, inescapable dread of a terminal diagnosis. The victims aren't just killed. They are forced to marinate in their own terror. They spend their last week on Earth desperately trying to solve a puzzle, to understand the incomprehensible, all while the clock is ticking. It's a psychological torture chamber. It preys on the most human of instincts. The desperate hope for a cure, the frantic search for an answer when there might not be one. The fear isn't that you'll die. It's that you know exactly when you'll die, and you are powerless to stop it. When Hollywood came calling, the challenge was immense. How do you translate something so deeply rooted in Japanese aesthetics and cultural anxieties for a Western audience? The 2002 American remake, The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski, succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, not by simply copying the original, but by transposing its themes into an American key. The film swapped the humid, crowded backdrop of Japan for the dreary, rain-slicked Pacific Northwest. The atmosphere became less about quiet, spiritual dread and more about a kind of damp, gothic decay. The abstract, almost surreal imagery of the Japanese cursed video was replaced with more concrete, symbolic visuals. The writhing maggots, the chair, the burning tree, and of course, the horses. These were images that resonated with Western iconography of death, madness, and suffering. Most importantly, the ghost herself was remade. Sadako became Samara Morgan. Her backstory was fleshed out, made more explicitly tragic and monstrous to fit a Western narrative sensibility that often demands more psychological explanation. She wasn't just a psychic. She was an adopted child, a cuckoo in the nest whose evil was a tangible, destructive force that drove her adoptive mother to madness. This reframing tapped into American fears surrounding the breakdown of the family unit, the bad seed child, and the dark secrets hidden beneath the surface of suburban life. The genius of the remake was in recognizing that the core concept, the viral curse, the ticking clock, the terrifying transmission through media, was universally horrifying. It didn't need to be Japanese to be scary. The fear of your television turning against you, of a technology meant to entertain actually delivering your death warrant, is a fear that transcends culture. And that final iconic scene, it's a masterclass in terror. The moment when the ghost proves she is not bound by the rules of reality, when the barrier of the screen dissolves and she physically and possibly crawls out of the television and into the safety of your living room, it was a cultural reset. It cemented the idea of the techno-Yurei in the global consciousness. Sadako and her American counterpart, Samara, did more than just launch a successful franchise. They rewrote the rules for what a ghost could be. They were the proof of concept that ancient folklore could not only survive in the modern world, but could thrive by hijacking its technologies. The ghost was no longer confined to a specific place, a dusty attic, a forgotten graveyard. a lonely stretch of road. The new haunting ground was the network itself. The ghost could be anywhere and everywhere at once. It could be copied, shared, and forwarded. This was a chilling revelation. It meant the protective walls of our homes were meaningless. The real threat wasn't an intruder breaking down the door. It was a signal being broadcast through the air, an image burned onto a disk, a presence waiting patiently in the static. After Ringu, every flickering screen held a new kind of menace. Every unexpected phone call carried a sliver of dread. The Yurei had successfully conquered the television set. But technology doesn't stand still. A new frontier was opening up, a global network of interconnected screens that would make the humble VCR look like a relic from the Stone Age. The ghost had found its way into our living rooms, but its next leap would take it directly into our hands and into our minds through the cold, glowing light of the internet. The turn of the millennium didn't just bring fears of a digital apocalypse. It brought a new kind of ghost. A ghost that didn't need a well, or a house, or even a physical body to anchor it to our world. It just needed a connection, a dial-up tone, a pixelated screen. The Yurei, an ancient spirit born of betrayal and sorrow, was about to receive a system-wide update. It was logging on. This new evolution of terror found its ultimate expression in a 2001 film that felt less like a movie and more like a prophecy. Kiyoshi Kurosawa's masterpiece, Cairo, or as it was known in the West, Pulse. Where Ringu used technology as a vessel for a curse, Cairo presented something far more terrifying. It suggested that the technology itself was the curse. The film opens not with a sudden shock, but with a creeping, unshakable sense of dread, a profound and deeply modern loneliness that permeates every frame. The characters are isolated, living in drab apartments in a sprawling, anonymous Tokyo, their primary interactions filtered through the ghostly glow of a computer monitor. The central idea of Cairo is chillingly simple. The afterlife, the realm of the dead, is full. It has reached its storage capacity, and so the ghosts are leaking out, seeping into our world through the path of least resistance, the internet. They aren't trying to scare us, not in the traditional sense. They are trying to share their eternal, unbearable loneliness. The internet, which was built on the promise of connecting everyone, becomes the very thing that dissolves the boundary between the living and the dead, creating a pandemic of existential despair. The film's most iconic image is the Forbidden Room, doors sealed with red tape. Behind these doors, people have encountered the ghosts online and have simply given up. They've withered away, leaving behind nothing but a black stain on the wall, a human-shaped shadow, like a sole photograph of their final moment of surrender. This red tape is the 21st century version of the cursed talisman, the paper ofuda meant to ward off evil. But here it's a warning. Do not enter. Do not connect. Do not look. Because what you'll find inside isn't a monster waiting to tear you apart. It's a mirror, a reflection of the ultimate isolation that awaits us all. When we finally see the ghosts of Cairo, they are unlike any that came before. They aren't the violently contorting Sadako or the rattling Kayako. They are slow, glitching apparitions. They move with an unnatural, laggy quality like a corrupted video file struggling to play. They are ethereal, almost transparent, their forms wavering and unstable. They are the human spirit rendered as bad data. They don't scream for revenge. They whisper for connection. In one of the film's most haunting scenes, a character confronts one of these digital phantoms and asks what it wants. The ghost doesn't threaten. It doesn't rage. Through a distorted, computerized voice, it simply says, "Help me." This is the Yurei's core concept of powerful, lingering emotion, asterisk on an asterisk, reimagined for a digital age. It's no longer about a singular, violent injustice. It's about a collective, ambient sorrow. The horror in Cairo isn't the fear of a violent death. It's the fear of a meaningless life, of dying alone and being forgotten, of becoming just another ghost in an infinite, indifferent machine. The film suggests that our hyper-connected world hasn't brought us closer together. It has just created more efficient ways to be alone, together. We stare at our screens searching for a signal, a sign that someone else is out there, and in doing so we open a door for the lonely dead to reach back. This idea of a digital curse wasn't confined to cinema. It was already breeding in the dark corners of the early internet. It took the form of urban legends, what we would now call creepypasta. One of the most famous was the story of the Red Room curse. The legend tells of a pop-up ad that appears on a victim's computer. It's a simple black text on a red background that asks, "Do you like?" Even if you close it, it reappears, the question slowly completing itself. Do you like the red room? Once the question is fully asked, the victim is found dead. Their walls painted red with their own blood. The genius of the Red Room story, and others like it, is that it's a ghost story that spreads like a virus, using the very network it warns against. Reading the story feels like you could be exposing yourself to the curse. It blurred the line between fiction and reality, making the reader a potential participant in the horror. It was a self-replicating Yurei, a meme with a body count. You didn't have to watch a videotape, you just had to click the wrong link, see the wrong image, read the wrong post. The haunted house was no longer a physical place. It was your browser. Why did this digital evolution of the Yurei strike such a nerve? Because it tapped into a brand new set of anxieties. The internet was a frontier, a vast, unregulated space that we didn't fully understand. It was a place where identities could be faked, where information could be corrupted, and where you never truly knew who or what you were talking to. It was a modern-day spirit world, a non-physical plane of existence where minds could meet. And if minds could meet, why couldn't spirits? This new techno-horror perfectly captured the feeling of being adrift in a sea of information, of losing your humanity to the cold logic of a machine. The Yurei was no longer just a symbol of past trauma. It was now a symbol of present-day alienation. It's the fear that the more we connect digitally, the more we disconnect emotionally. The fear that our screens are not windows to the world, but black mirrors that only reflect our own solitude back at us. The fear that in building this global network, we inadvertently created the perfect ghost. One that could be everywhere at once, a specter made of light and code, whispering its despair through our speakers. The Yurei had successfully crossed the digital divide. It had shed its physical anchors and become a free-floating entity, a true ghost in the machine. Its image, the long black hair, the white dress, the unnerving disjointed movements, was now an internationally recognized symbol of terror. But this global recognition came with a new challenge. The ghost that had haunted Japan for centuries was about to make its biggest journey yet. Not through a wire, but across the Pacific Ocean. It was heading to Hollywood. And the question was, could this quintessentially Japanese spirit survive the translation? Could the deep cultural anxieties and Buddhist Shinto beliefs that gave birth to the Yurei be repackaged for a Western audience? Or would something vital be lost in the remake? The answer, like the ghosts themselves, is not a simple one. In the process of crossing the Pacific, the Yurei did not just survive, it mutated. It was stripped down, re-engineered, and unleashed on an unsuspecting audience that was hungry for a new kind of fear. And the patient zero of this outbreak was a videotape. When Hollywood decided to remake Hideo Nakata's 1998 masterpiece, Ringu, they faced a monumental task. The film wasn't just scary because of a ghost crawling out of a TV. It was scary because it tapped into a distinctly Japanese anxiety, the uneasy marriage of ancient superstition and modern technology. The spirit of Sadako Yamamura was a product of her time and place. Her backstory involves nensha, a paranormal concept of spirit photography, and her origins are tied to the sea, a place of immense power and dread in Japanese folklore. Sadako was a symptom of a society grappling with its own identity. She was the ghost in the machine, the repressed past bubbling up through the cathode ray tube. Then came the 2002 American remake, The Ring. Sadako Yamamura became Samara Morgan. And in that name change, a universe of meaning was altered. The core visual horror, the part that needs no translation, remained perfectly intact. The long, stringy black hair obscuring the face, the unnatural, jerky movements, the chilling phone call promising death in 7 days. Director Gore Verbinski masterfully replicated the aesthetic of dread that Nakata had pioneered. The film was a massive, terrifying success. But look closer, and you see what was left behind on the cutting room floor. Samara's backstory was rewritten for a Western palette. The complex themes of societal anxiety were replaced with a more familiar, almost Freudian family drama. She was an adopted child, misunderstood, and ultimately murdered by a desperate mother. Her evil wasn't a curse born of cultural friction. It was presented as an innate, almost demonic malevolence. The Buddhist concept of a spirit trapped by trauma, unable to move on, was flattened into a more straightforward story of a vengeful monster. The mystery for the protagonist, Rachel Keller, wasn't to understand the cultural forces that created the ghost, but to solve a detective story, to find the body, to give the ghost a proper burial, hoping that would appease her. This is a fundamentally Western approach to a ghost story. It's rooted in the idea that hauntings are problems to be solved, puzzles to be unlocked. Find the bones, say the rites, and the spirit will find peace. But that's not how an Onryō works. An Onryō's rage is not a puzzle. It is a state of being. It is a force of nature, like a hurricane or an earthquake. You don't solve it. You can only hope to survive it. The American film's ending, where Rachel realizes that freeing Samara's body only unleashed her further, was a brilliant twist that brought it closer to the Japanese original sense of hopelessness. But the journey there was through a familiar American landscape of broken homes and psychological thrillers, not the uncanny valley of Japanese spiritualism. If The Ring was a careful translation, then 2004's The Grudge was an even stranger experiment. This time, Hollywood didn't just import the story. They imported the director. Takashi Shimizu, who created the original Ju-on, was given the reins to remake his own film for an American audience. The setting even remained in Tokyo. On the surface, it seemed poised to be the most authentic adaptation possible. The house was the same. The ghosts, Kayako and Toshio, were the same. The horrifying, guttural death rattle was the same. But one crucial element was changed: the protagonist. Instead of a Japanese local, the story was now seen through the eyes of Karen, an American exchange student played by Sarah Michelle Gellar. This single change reframed the entire narrative. The horror of Ju-on is about the implosion of the Japanese family unit, a domestic tragedy so potent it poisons the very wood and plaster of a home. It's a universal fear, but one felt with a particular sharpness in a society that places immense value on family structure. In The Grudge, however, the story becomes one of a foreigner adrift in a strange and dangerous land. The horror is now filtered through a lens of cultural alienation. Karen isn't just fighting a ghost. She's fighting a phenomenon she has no cultural context for. The Japanese characters in the film try to warn her, to explain, but the concepts are foreign. The horror becomes, in part, the horror of the other, the fear of ancient exotic forces that Western logic cannot comprehend. It's an effective horror trope in its own right, but it's a significant departure from the original's intent. Ju-on argues that this kind of tragedy can happen to anyone, anywhere, right in their own home. The Grudge subtly suggests that this is a uniquely Japanese brand of horror, something an outsider stumbles into. So why were these changes made? The answer is simple: accessibility. Hollywood studios believed, perhaps correctly, that a mass American audience needed a familiar entry point. They needed a protagonist who looked and thought like them. They needed psychological motivations they could recognize, like a troubled childhood or a detective's need to solve a case. The deep philosophical underpinnings of Shinto Buddhist beliefs about death and the soul were deemed too complex, too alien for a 90-minute thrill ride. The concept of On, that all-consuming grudge that is the ghost's entire reason for being, was simplified to revenge. The result was the birth of a new subgenre, but it came at a cost. The J-horror boom of the early 2000s created a powerful, but ultimately shallow archetype: the scary Asian ghost girl. The image of the Yurei, the pale skin, the dark hair, the white robe, was successfully exported, but the soul was often held up at customs. The Yurei became a visual shorthand for a certain kind of quiet, creeping dread, but they were detached from the very cultural anxieties that gave them their power. They were no longer commentaries on societal ills or tragic figures deserving of pity as much as fear. They were monsters, pure and simple. Yet, it's impossible to call this translation a complete failure, because in simplifying the Yurei, Hollywood also amplified its reach exponentially. These remakes introduced millions of people to a form of horror that didn't rely on gore or jump scares alone. It was a horror of atmosphere, of psychology, of quiet, creeping inevitability. It revitalized a genre that had become stale, dominated by slashers and creature features. The influence of Sadako and Kayako can be seen in countless Western horror films that followed, from Insidious to Sinister to Lights Out. So was something vital lost? Absolutely. The intricate tapestry of Japanese belief was unraveled, and only the most terrifying threads were woven into a new, simpler pattern. The ghost was no longer a tragic figure born from a specific cultural grief, but a viral entity, a puzzle to be solved by a Western hero. But in that loss, something else was created. A new global horror icon. The Yurei had achieved a strange kind of immortality, not by finding peace in the next life, but by becoming a permanent resident in the nightmares of the entire world. This global fame, however, would have a strange, reflective effect back in Japan, forcing its own creators to ask a new question. In a world that now knows our ghosts, how do we make them scary again? The J-horror boom of the late 90s and early 2000s wasn't just a film movement. It was a cultural export on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, the pale face, the lank black hair, the jerky, unnatural movements of the Onryō were everywhere. Hollywood churned out remakes, video stores created J-horror sections, and Sadako Yamamura became as recognizable a horror icon as Michael Myers. For a brief, terrifying moment, Japan held a monopoly on fear. But with that global saturation came a new, insidious problem: predictability. The ghost crawling out of the television, the croaking death rattle from the top of the stairs. These images, once paralyzingly scary, were becoming tropes. They were being parodied in comedies, referenced in cartoons. The Yurei, the embodiment of a uniquely Japanese cultural anxiety, was on the verge of becoming a global cliché. The monster had been seen too many times, and the fear was beginning to fade. Back in Japan, filmmakers and storytellers were faced with a daunting challenge. The rest of the world was busy copying their last great idea. For them, simply repeating the formula of Ringu or Ju-on was a creative dead end. The question hanging over the entire industry was a heavy one. How do you make the Yurei terrifying again to an audience that already knows all its tricks? The answer, it turned out, wasn't to create a scarier ghost, but to change the very reality the ghost inhabited. The first major evolution was a brutal turn towards realism. If the slick cinematic horror of the blockbuster hits was becoming predictable, the solution was to make it feel messy, chaotic, and frighteningly authentic. This gave rise to the found footage and mockumentary style of J-horror. The most potent example of this is the 2005 film Noroi, The Curse. Noroi isn't just a movie. It's presented as the final unfinished documentary of a paranormal researcher who vanished while investigating a series of seemingly unrelated, bizarre events. What makes it so effective is how it meticulously builds its own mythology from the ground up. It doesn't rely on the audience's prior knowledge of Yurei. Instead, it introduces a forgotten, ancient demon named Kagataba and slowly, piece by agonizing piece, connects psychic children, strange television personalities, and tragic deaths to its reawakening. The horror isn't in the jump scare. It's in the creeping, dawning realization that all these disparate threads of weirdness are weaving together into a tapestry of absolute doom. The film uses the raw, unpolished aesthetic of documentary footage to sell its reality. The grainy video, the awkward interviews, the moments of technical difficulty. It all feels disturbingly real, as if you've stumbled upon something you were never meant to see. The Yurei and Noroi aren't just popping out of closets. They are glitches in the fabric of reality, caught on tape by accident. Their presence felt in the escalating dread and the psychological collapse of everyone involved. It was a masterclass in making the supernatural feel grounded and immediate again. At the same time, another group of creators took a different path. Instead of doubling down on pure horror, they started blending it with other genres, creating strange, unpredictable hybrids. If the audience thought they knew what was coming, the best way to scare them was to keep them completely off balance. Films began to mix bone-chilling terror with biting social satire, or profound human drama, or even absurd black comedy. The Yurei was no longer just a monster. It was a catalyst for exploring the deeper anxieties of modern Japanese life. Take a film like One Cut of the Dead. While it starts as a zombie film, its spirit is pure Yurei meta-commentary. It deconstructs the very process of making a horror film, blending genuine scares with laugh-out-loud comedy, and a surprisingly heartfelt story about family. Or consider the work of directors who use ghost stories to talk about social isolation, the pressures of conformity, or the decay of traditional communities. The ghost was no longer just a vengeful spirit from a forgotten past. It was a manifestation of the loneliness of living in a crowded city, the fear of being forgotten by society, the terror of a life without meaning. By wrapping the horror in these other genres, these stories could sneak past the audience's defenses. You'd be laughing one moment, contemplating a poignant social issue the next, and then when you were least expecting it, the true horror would strike, hitting you that much harder because you had let your guard down. This creative renaissance also involved a deep dive back into the source material. The Onryō had become the global face of the Yurei, But she was just one figure in a vast, sprawling pantheon of Japanese supernatural folklore. Creators began to realize that to innovate, they needed to look beyond the long-haired ghost. They started exploring the rich tapestry of yokai, the countless other spirits, demons, and monsters that populate Japanese legends. This brought a much-needed variety and unpredictability back to the genre. The threat was no longer just a grudge-filled human spirit. It could be a creature born of superstition, a cursed object with a bizarre history, or a malevolent nature spirit. This expansion of the mythology meant that audiences could no longer be sure what kind of entity they were dealing with, what its rules were, or how it could be stopped. It reintroduced a sense of mystery and genuine unknowability that had been lost. The horror was fresh again because the monsters were new, drawing from centuries of folklore that had been largely untapped by mainstream cinema. Perhaps the most significant evolution, however, was the change in where the ghosts lived. The haunted houses, the old wells, the dark forests. These were the traditional homes of the Yurei. But as the 21st century progressed, a new, far more pervasive haunted space emerged: the internet. The well in Ringu was a metaphor for the terrifying power of old, forgotten media, the videotape. The new generation of Japanese horror realized that the internet was the ultimate cursed object. It was a place of anonymity, of rapid-fire information, of stories that could spread across the globe in an instant, their origins and authenticity impossible to verify. This gave birth to a new wave of digital folklore. The Yurei adapted. It became a ghost in the machine in the most literal sense. The curse was no longer on a physical tape, but in a corrupted image file, a strange pop-up ad, a video link that you should never ever click. Stories that originated on Japanese internet forums like 2channel became modern legends, spreading like a virus. Tales like Kisaragi Station, about a person who gets off at a train station that doesn't exist, or the Red Room Curse, a pop-up that seals your fate, blurred the lines between fiction and a terrifying what if. The Yurei no longer needed to crawl out of a television set, because it was already inside the screen you were staring at. This new digital horror tapped into a very modern anxiety, the fear of the unknown that lurks just behind the comforting glow of our devices. The ghost was no longer a remnant of the past. It was a product of the present, a terrifying bug in the code of our hyperconnected world. The Yurei had proven it could adapt to any medium, any era. It had crawled out of the television and logged onto the internet, but its evolution was far from over. The next question wasn't just how to make it scary, but where would it appear next? In a world more connected yet more isolated than ever, the Yurei found fertile new ground not just on our screens, but inside the very systems we've built to connect us. The internet was supposed to be our global village, a place of infinite connection. Instead, for many, it became a landscape of profound loneliness, a space where you can be surrounded by millions, yet feel utterly, terrifyingly alone. And in that digital silence, the old whispers found a new echo. Think about it. The core mechanics of a Yurei curse are tailor-made for the digital age. A spirit, bound by a powerful negative emotion, latches onto a person or a place. Its influence spreads, infecting others who come into contact with it, a contagion of fear. Now what does that sound like? A viral video, a hateful meme, a rumor that spreads like wildfire, destroying a reputation in hours. The internet is the ultimate vector for a curse. The Japanese were the first to see this. In the late 90s and early 2000s, as the world was logging on, their storytellers were already asking the terrifying questions. What if the ghosts weren't in the attic anymore? What if they were in the modem? The 1998 film The Ring was the Trojan horse, smuggling the Yurei into the West on a VHS tape. But it was Kiyoshi Kurosawa's 2001 masterpiece, Pulse or Cairo, that truly understood the horror of the digital frontier. In that film, ghosts weren't just using technology, they were invading our world through it. The internet wasn't a tool for them, it was a doorway, a way for the overflowing loneliness of the afterlife to spill into our own, promising a quiet, eternal isolation. The film's most chilling line isn't a scream, but a whisper. Help me. A message that flashes on a screen, the desperate, eternal plea of a ghost reaching out from the ether. This was the birth of the Techno Yurei, a ghost unbound by physical location. It's not in the well, it's not in the house, it's in the signal, it's in the code. It travels at the speed of light, and its grudge is no longer personal, it's systemic. This new kind of ghost doesn't just want revenge on one person. It embodies a deeper, more modern anxiety, the fear of social contagion, of technological alienation, and of a world where our connections are a mile wide, but an inch deep. It preys on the very isolation that technology creates. You're alone in your room, scrolling through images of other people's perfect lives. And then, the call comes from an unknown number. The distorted image appears in your video chat. The ghost is no longer outside your door. It's in your pocket, on your desk, inches from your face. And this concept, this techno-Yurei, has seeped into our own digital folklore. Think of the creepypastas, those urban legends born on the internet. Stories like the Red Room Curse, a Japanese pop-up that supposedly kills whoever sees it, are direct descendants of the Yurei mythos. Think of the Slender Man, a creature born in a forum, whose legend was built and spread entirely online, a collectively created specter that eventually bled into the real world with tragic consequences. We may not call them Yurei, but we understand the underlying fear. The fear that something malevolent can spread through our networks, something you can't fight, you can't reason with, and you can't escape because unplugging is no longer an option. Our lives are built on this network. To leave it is to become a ghost yourself. This is the ultimate evolution of the Yurei. It journeyed from a misty figure in a Heian-era scroll, to a wild-haired avenger on the kabuki stage, to a grainy, glitching horror on a television screen, and finally, to an abstract terror living in the very architecture of our modern world. It has become a global phantom. Its white kimono and long black hair are now an international shorthand for a very specific kind of dread. But in making that journey, it never lost its original meaning. In fact, its message has only become more urgent, more relevant than ever. Because when you strip away the jump scares, the creepy sound design, and the unsettling visuals, what is the story of the Yurei really about? It's not about ghosts. It's about us. It's a story about the consequences of our actions. It's a brutal, unflinching look at what happens when injustice is allowed to fester. Every Yurei, from Oiwa to Okiku to Sadako, is a receipt, a debt come due. They are the terrifying embodiment of a simple, universal truth. What is buried does not always stay buried. The pain you inflict on others, especially those who are weaker than you, doesn't just vanish when they do. It lingers. It curdles. It waits. The Yurei is a cultural immune response to injustice. In a society that often valued the group over the individual and harmony over confrontation, the Yurei was the ultimate expression of suppressed rage. It was the voice for the voiceless, the power for the powerless. It was a promise that even if the law, the samurai, or the husband failed to deliver justice in this life, a far more terrible and impartial justice was waiting in the next. The Yurei is a force of cosmic balancing. It doesn't just punish the guilty party. Its rage is so immense, so all-consuming, that it spills out and creates a stain, a curse that infects everything it touches. It's a warning that the consequences of a single cruel act can ripple outwards, poisoning a family, a house, a bloodline, a whole society. And that is why these stories have followed us here, into the 21st century. We live in an age of ghosts. We are haunted by the digital specters of our past selves, old profiles and forgotten posts frozen in time. Companies are creating AI chatbots that mimic the dead, allowing you to speak to a ghost of your loved one, a lingering echo in the machine. We ghost people in relationships, disappearing without a word, leaving behind a confusing silence filled with unanswered questions and unresolved emotion. Does any of that sound familiar? The modern world, for all its technological marvels, is a ghost factory. We are creating our own Yurei every single day, in 1,000 different ways. So what have we learned? After this long journey into the shadows of Japan, we've learned that a ghost story can be more than just a scare. It can be a history lesson, a moral fable, and a mirror held up to the society that tells it. The Yurei shows us the anxieties of an entire culture across 1,000 years. Fears of social change, the breakdown of the family, the oppression of women, and the loss of tradition. And now, in its modern form, it reflects our global fears. Of isolation, of technology we don't fully understand, and of the invisible viral threats that can turn our world upside down in an instant. The enduring power of the Yurei is its profound simplicity. It's a reminder that our world is built on a foundation of countless stories, and many of them are stories of pain. It asks us to listen to the whispers of the wronged, to acknowledge the forgotten, and to understand that true horror isn't a monster from another world. True horror is human. It's the cruelty we are capable of, the pain we choose to ignore, and the rage that is born from injustice. The Yurei is just the consequence. It is the fury that comes after. So the next time you feel a chill in a quiet room, or see a flicker on a screen out of the corner of your eye, maybe don't just ask yourself if there's a ghost. Ask yourself why it's there. What unresolved story does it carry? What injustice does it represent? Because the vengeful ghosts of Japanese folklore teach us one final chilling lesson. The dead don't speak, but they demand to be heard. And the real horror isn't the ghost in the machine. It's the slow dawning realization that we are the ones who put it there.